Hi folks, this time in Goss's Garage, we are going to talk about one of the hottest subjects that has ever dealt with automobiles, and it's been a hot topic since the invention of the automobile, and that's the oil that goes in the engine. Now, granted, you can get good professional advice from just about any do-it-yourselfer that you ever want to talk to, because every one of them is an authority on oil. They probably don't know how to take the cap off and pour it properly, but they're an authority on oil, what oil you should use. All right, well, what oil should you use? Well, let's get to that in just a second, but the first thing is, what are the different types of oil? Well, there are three basic types of oil. There is a conventional oil, which is the old dinosaur oil. Works well in a lot of cars. It is a situation of good, better, best, and better is what's called a synthetic blend or semi-synthetic. That's a combination of conventional oil and synthetic oil, and it gives better protection. Best is full synthetic, like we see here. Now, synthetic oils, they give you the longest life out of your engine. They minimize wear. They give you maybe a little teeny bit better fuel economy and performance, but the big thing is protecting the engine. Now, these are not designed to extend the oil change interval. That remains relatively what your owner's manual says, because how long oil stays in an engine depends on the design of the engine and the related engine parts, not so much the oil you put in the engine. Okay, so good, better, best. You make that choice. But now you've got all of these different oils, different types and so on. How do you decide which one you should be using in your car? Well, number one, you have to look at the owner's manual. And in the owner's manual, you'll find that there are going to be ratings on the oil. Now, these ratings, number one, is going to be the quality of the oil. Now, the quality of the oil can be determined by this seal right here on the oil. It will give you an API service rating. That has to meet or exceed the service rating in your owner's manual. Now, going better, that's always a good thing. Going below, that could be disastrous. So, we want the proper service rating. Then in the middle of this donut here, we have the viscosity. That's the thickness of the oil. Now, when we talk about the thickness of oil, we're talking about how much force it takes to push the oil through the engine. Now, back in the day, you had all kinds of do-it-yourselfers that always felt, and still do, many of them, that thicker oil is better than thinner oil. Well, that isn't necessarily the case. You see, the thickness of the oil that's required by a car is determined by the clearance between the moving parts inside the engine. And the more precise the machining, the tighter those clearances, the thinner the oil. Otherwise, you put a thick oil into a car that has really tight clearances, what's going to happen is that it's going to dam up behind the various parts because it's too thick to move through the gap between the parts. All right, so you always want to make sure that you use the specified oil unless there's a technical service bulletin that tells you otherwise. So just because a car requires a 0W20 as opposed to a 20W50, well, that doesn't mean that 2050 is going to work well in the car that requires 020, because you may increase oil pressure but reduce oil volume, or the amount of oil circulating through the engine. And that's an important factor because oil is as much a coolant as the coolant in the radiator. It cools all these metal parts because it's what actually touches the metal parts. So you've got to keep it moving, to keep it cool, to keep the internal parts of the engine cool. So proper viscosity. And don't let somebody that's working on cars tell you that thicker oil is better or something like that. Just because a technician changes oil, maybe that's all they do all day long. They change oil. They may do 10, 20 jobs a day. Does that make them an oil engineer? I don't think so. Doesn't mean that they know anything at all about oils. It just means that they are expert at changing oil, not at recommending oils or anything of the kind. So, owner's manual, that's the Bible, because most manufacturers spend millions upon millions of dollars doing testing to find out which oil belongs in the car. The next thing, we have high mileage oils. Now, high mileage oil, you'll listen to the ads on TV and see it in print and so on. High mileage oil says 75,000 miles or more, you got to put high mileage oil in there. Well, I would disagree with that. Now, I think high mileage oil is great, but not specifically at 75,000 miles. See, no two engines are going to have exactly the same amount of wear on them at 75,000 miles. And one of the big differences between conventional oil, whether it's synthetic or blend or absolute conventional, and high mileage oil, is that high mileage oil has more chemicals to swell the oil seals inside the engine. Now, suppose you have an engine that isn't burning any oil or doing anything wrong, and you put the high mileage oil in there, and those seal swellers, they swell the seals up real tight around the moving parts. Now the seals wear into this new, tighter configuration. You go a few thousand miles and you say, I don't see any difference here, so I'm going to go back to a conventional type of oil, non-high mileage. You put it in, and what happens? Well, the car burns oil because now, without all those extra seal swellers in there, the seals relax and they allow oil to go past them. So it's not a good thing. It's a great thing when you have an engine that is getting a little tired and you want to prolong the agony. It's a great thing to go with. But don't do it prematurely because you might wind up regretting the choice. So, owner's manual, that is the real source for information for the oil that goes in your car. The only exception to that is when there is a technical service bulletin that says to do something different because they've found a problem with their original decision on the oil. And if you want the best oil, always use a full synthetic oil, which can actually double or triple the life expectancy of your engine. So that's oil in a nutshell. And if you have a question or a comment, how about dropping me a line right here at radio@goss-garage.com.